For decades, certain decisions were made far from public view. They were not announced. They were not debated. They simply happened, quietly shaping the world while leaving no visible trace behind. These decisions were never written into history books. They existed only in restricted files, locked away from those who might ask questions. What remained was not evidence, but absence. As the Cold War deepened, secrecy became routine. Information was hidden not to protect people, but to protect choices already made. Truth was no longer denied. It was delayed. Entire operations vanished without explanation. Facilities were erased. Routes were closed. Records were altered until only fragments remained. What made these files dangerous was not their content, but their implications. They suggested coordination, planning, a system designed to function without accountability. Years later, investigators began to notice patterns. Not answers, but repetition. Different locations. The same silence. The deeper they searched, the more the trail dissolved. Names were removed. Dates were missing. Entire sections were sealed without explanation. It became clear that forgetting was not accidental. It was managed, controlled, and enforced through silence. This was only the beginning, because behind these files were others, older, deeper, and far more carefully buried. The files did not disappear by accident. They were removed deliberately, piece by piece, long before anyone knew to look for them. What survived was not truth, but carefully constructed gaps. In different countries, at different times, the same patterns emerged. Facilities shut down overnight. Personnel reassigned without explanation. Budgets redirected into projects that officially never existed. Witnesses described unusual movements. Convoys traveling at night. Unmarked trains passing through restricted routes. Cargo that was never logged, never inspected, and never questioned. What made these operations invisible was their simplicity. No single action seemed significant. No document revealed the whole picture. Only when fragments were placed side by side did something unsettling appear. Investigators who followed these trails often reached the same conclusion. Someone had planned this in advance. Not years ahead, but decades. With enough foresight to ensure that even discovery would lead nowhere. Attempts to access classified material were met with silence. Requests were delayed. Files were declared lost. Entire archives were sealed under vague legal justifications. In some cases, researchers reported pressure. Not direct threats, but warnings. Carefully worded suggestions to stop asking questions. To focus on safer subjects. The deeper the investigation went, the more resistance appeared. Not from one institution, but from many. As if secrecy itself had become decentralized, woven into the system. This was no longer about hiding a single event. It was about protecting a structure, a framework built on decisions that could not be undone without consequences. And yet, fragments continued to surface. A document referenced in an old report, a photograph without a caption, a testimony buried in unrelated records. Each fragment suggested the same unsettling idea, that history, as it was presented, was incomplete, and that some of its most important chapters were never meant to be read. Because if these decisions were exposed, they would not rewrite a single story. They would force an entirely different understanding of how the world was shaped. By the time the fragments began to align, it was already too late to stop what had been set in motion. The structure was no longer hidden behind walls or documents. It existed within procedures, policies, and silent agreements. What emerged was not a single organization, but a network, a system designed to operate without visibility. Its strength came not from secrecy alone, but from normalization. Over time, extraordinary actions became routine. Emergency measures turned permanent. Temporary permissions evolved into unquestioned authority. Those involved rarely understood the full scope of their participation. Each role was limited, each task isolated. No individual carried enough information to challenge the whole. This fragmentation was intentional. Responsibility was divided until it dissolved. Decisions were made collectively, yet owned by no one. In official records, these actions appeared justified. National security, stability, prevention of greater harm. Language became a tool. Words were chosen carefully, not to explain, but to obscure. Operations were renamed. Consequences were reclassified. As years passed, the original purpose blurred. What began as a response to crisis became an inherited system. New generations enforced rules they did not create, for reasons they no longer questioned. Occasionally, something went wrong. A leak, a misfiled report, an unexpected witness. Each incident was contained quickly. Investigations redirected. Attention shifted elsewhere. The system corrected itself. What made this structure resilient was its invisibility. There was no single door to break down, no central archive to expose, only layers of compliance, each reinforcing the next. Those who sensed something was wrong often struggled to explain it. They felt the pressure, but could not trace its source. They encountered barriers without clear authors. By this stage, secrecy no longer required enforcement. It sustained itself, maintained by habit, fear, and the belief that exposure would cause irreversible damage. And perhaps that belief was true, because dismantling the system would not simply reveal the past. It would destabilize the present. The question was no longer whether the truth could be uncovered. It was whether anyone was prepared for what would follow. By the final stage, secrecy no longer needed protection. It had become tradition, an inherited rule passed down quietly, reinforced by silence rather than force. Those who benefited from the system rarely acknowledged it. They spoke of progress, of stability, of necessary sacrifices made in difficult times. But the consequences were no longer abstract. They could be measured in altered borders, distorted narratives, and generations shaped by decisions they never consented to. The system had succeeded because it never presented itself as a single entity. There was no enemy to confront, no headquarters to expose, only procedures, policies, and agreements buried beneath layers of justification. Even when fragments of truth surfaced, they were dismissed as coincidence, or conspiracy, or misunderstanding. The most effective defense was disbelief. Over time, the original intent became irrelevant. What mattered was preservation, not of truth, but of continuity. Those who questioned the system faced a quiet dilemma: expose what they found and risk destabilizing everything, or remain silent and become part of what they feared. Many chose silence, not because they agreed, but because the cost of speaking felt too high. And so the structure endured, not through fear alone, but through participation. Every delay, every redirected inquiry, every closed file reinforced it. The final realization was simple and unsettling. History was not hidden. It was edited. What the world remembered was not the result of chance, but of selection. What was forgotten had been chosen just as carefully. This did not mean the truth was gone forever, only that it would surface slowly, in fragments, through patterns rather than proof. And when it did, it would not arrive as revelation. It would arrive as recognition. Because the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we never learn. They are the ones we slowly accept were always there. As time passed, the system stopped reacting to threats. It began anticipating them, not through intelligence alone, but through pattern recognition. Data was no longer collected to understand the past. It was used to predict behavior, trends, resistance, public reaction. Entire populations became variables. Economic pressure replaced force. Information replaced weapons. Compliance was achieved without confrontation. What made this evolution effective was its invisibility. No announcements were made. No laws openly rewritten. Changes were introduced gradually, framed as progress. Institutions adapted quietly. Education shifted focus. Media narrowed acceptable narratives. Critical questions were labeled disruptive rather than necessary. Those who noticed the shift often struggled to explain it. Nothing appeared overtly wrong. Each change seemed reasonable on its own. It was only in hindsight that the pattern emerged. Technology accelerated the process. Systems learned faster than humans could respond. Decisions once made by committees were automated. Accountability became abstract. At this stage, secrecy was no longer about hiding information. It was about controlling interpretation. Facts could exist openly, as long as their meaning remained fragmented. Contradictions were allowed to surface. Confusion became an asset. When everything felt uncertain, nothing felt urgent. Dissent did not disappear. It dissolved, broken into isolated voices that never aligned long enough to matter. Those within the system justified their actions as necessary. They spoke of stability, of preventing chaos, of choosing the lesser harm. But harm does not disappear when it is managed. It accumulates, slowly, across generations. The most unsettling realization came when observers understood this was no longer temporary. There was no plan to return to transparency, no final phase where control would be released. The system had achieved permanence, and permanence did not require loyalty, only participation, silence, and the belief that questioning it would make things worse. By the time this became clear, the system no longer needed protection. It had become normal, and what is normal is rarely challenged.